From breaking through as a Wonderkid in Western Australia to being ejected from an airport, Exile in France, being arrested in Paris on alleged drug offences, to finding his feet in the north of England and coming back to play in a Rugby World Cup. And that doesn't even take us up until this decade. This is the incredible story of the career of James O'Connor. Is this video getting demonetized? Almost definitely. But it's such a good story. At the time of his Super Rugby debut for the Western Force back in 2008, James O'Connor was the youngest player the league had ever seen. He already had a reputation in Australia thanks to his exploits in schoolboy rugby, and he wasted no time making an impact with a Western Force jersey on his back. His first full season was a sensation, and by the end of it, he was already a capped wallaby. Once again, the youngest ever player to achieve that accolade. He sewed up the Rookie of the Year award at both Test and club level that year. He continued that upward trajectory, scoring a hat-trick against Italy in 2009, and by the end of his time with the Force, he'd scored 306 points in 39 games. In 2012, he moved across Australia to the Melbourne Rebels, where he scored 201 points in 21 games. Despite being in his early 20s, O'Connor was already in his 5th season of professional rugby, and his experience meant that he'd already been added to Australia's senior leadership group. He started all 3 tests against the British and Irish Lions in 2013, scoring a try in the final game. But just a few weeks later, his test career was suddenly put on hold. O'Connor's early career was dogged by behavioural and disciplinary issues. He'd already been released by the Rebels at the end of the 2013 Super Rugby season, and he was forced to apologise to his Wallabies teammates for staying out of the hotel past the curfew. His Rugby Australia contract was then torn up altogether after an incident at Perth Airport, where allegedly he was ejected by security for being drunk. He was completely dropped from the Wallaby squad and forced to find his employment up north in Europe. Reading between the lines of some of these newspaper reports at the time, you do get the impression that there was maybe more to O'Connor's behavioural issues than was making the mainstream media. If you look at interviews with himself, people who knew him, or if you just talk to people who were around at the time, you get the sense that things had actually gotten quite bad, and by the time he left the Rebels, everyone was just sick of him. He eventually joined London Irish partway through the 2013-14 Premiership season. Utilised mainly as a fullback, he scored 100 points in 14 games, 22 of those coming in a single appearance against Worcester Warriors. It was to be just 1 season in England as he hopped over the channel to France to sign for Toulon for the next season. But that didn't last long either. Partway through the 14-15 season, O'Connor abandoned his Toulon contract in a bid to make it back into the Wallabies squad. He signed a contract with the Reds, and he performed reasonably well, earning himself a call into the Winer training squad for the 2015 World Cup. But ultimately, he didn't make the cut, and Michael Cheika did not select him for the squad that went on to play in the World Cup final. O'Connor once again left Australia and rejoined Toulon, but the off-field issues were far from over. The second Toulon stint was a miserable time for O'Connor. He became dependent on drugs and alcohol as he struggled to make himself at home in France. This culminated in him being arrested in Paris for allegedly trying to purchase cocaine. Now, of course, I'm cognizant that drug use and addiction are very serious topics, and I don't want to belittle that in any way. So what I thought I would do is I would read you a few quotes from James O'Connor where he speaks about it for himself. After the incident in Paris where he was arrested, he said this: "Looking back on it, it was a cry for help for sure. And because people started saying I was like this, I was like, all right, if that's how you want me to be, then I will be this in an extreme version. I pretended that I didn't care about anything. I lost interest. I was rebelling against it and made some terrible decisions." You almost become ashamed of it as well. Why do I feel like this? I've got a great life. I have a nice car. I've got a nice house. I've got a beautiful girlfriend. I have got a tight family. I've got all of these things. But if you don't feel right, none of it matters. Things then began to spiral completely out of control as reports in Australia claimed that he had suffered a heart attack on the team bus. This turned out to be fake news, but it is true that he passed out on the team bus from what he now thinks was an undiagnosed concussion. He left Toulon in 2017 with 116 points scored in 51 games. That was the lowest points per game tally of any point in his career. This time he returned to England to play for Sale Sharks. By the way, I hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you are, please consider subscribing to the channel, maybe leaving a comment with your thoughts. If you would like to support the channel a little bit more as well, you can get membership for just 99 pence a month. If you do decide to go for that, you'll get access to a selection of videos that you won't find anywhere else. All of that money goes back into supporting the channel, and I am hugely grateful for anybody who takes me up on that offer. Anyway, let's get back to the video. Something that plagued James O'Connor in the first 10 years of his career was the constant moving between positions. His prodigious talent meant that he was capable of wearing any jersey in the back line from 10 to 15. In fact, during his time at Toulon, he literally did start at least one game in every position from 10 to 15. Despite having started against the British and Irish Lions as a fly half, between 2014 and 2016, he only wore the number 10 jersey twice. At Toulon, he'd mostly been a fullback or a winger, but Sale Sharks utilised him as an outside centre. However, around about this time, things finally started to look up for O'Connor. In his own words, in 2018, he decided to draw a line in the sand and take footy seriously again. His performances were drawing the attention of the Wallabies selectors. In 2019, he was released from his Sale Sharks contract early to take up a contract back in Super Rugby, and this allowed Australia to select him for the 2019 Rugby World Cup. Remaining in the centres, he played 8 test matches for Australia that year, including 4 at the Global Showpiece. This included an 80-minute performance in a win over the All Blacks in the Rugby Championship. His exile was finally over. After 7 years abroad, O'Connor once again signed a Rugby Australia contract, which, as you can imagine, was rumoured to have strict behavioural clauses. On O'Connor's changing character, I actually found this really interesting interview with Drew Mitchell. Now, Drew Mitchell's known James O'Connor pretty much his whole career. They were teammates at Western Force and at Toulon, and of course for the Wallabies. So Mitchell said this: his general persona changed. When he turned up at Toulon, we had a team full of stars. James, even when he was at school, was always a big fish and the star that everyone turned to, and the one that got all the press and all the rest of it. And for the first time, when he turned up in Toulon, he was just one amongst others. No one was bigger than the team. And James's willingness to jump in line, be himself most certainly, but also do everything for the betterment of the group, was a big indication for me that he grew a fair amount in that time from when I played with him previously in Australia. He rejoined the Queensland Reds and was finally returned to his favoured fly half position. He was quickly made captain of the Reds and led them to the Super Rugby AU final that very season. He wore number 10 for every single game of that campaign, scoring 102 points in 10 games. O'Connor retained the Reds captaincy for the 2021 season and led them to the Super Rugby AU title. He scored a try in the final against the Brumbies and was once again back in the Australia fold, this time as a number 10. Sadly though, whilst he was back in the team, Australia struggled to pick up the wins. For the next Super Rugby season, he retained his place in the Reds starting team but relinquished the captaincy, attributing the decision to burnout. The appointment of Eddie Jones as Australia head coach was bad news for his Test career, and he was relegated from the first team down to Australia A, and once again required to play in the centres. Over the next couple of seasons, he drifted out of the Reds starting team, playing just 3 games in 2024, all off the bench. Looking back on all these interviews with James O'Connor over the years, I can't help but feel sorry for the guy. He's constantly mentioning how Australia is his home and all he wants to do is go back there and play for the Wallabies again, and how he really wants to be playing fly half. And yet, for one reason or another, at every turn, he's unable to do that. I also can't help but wonder what kind of advice and management he was getting through all of this period. Even if you go way back to when he left the Western Force originally, apparently the story there is his management went to the Force with wage demands and contract demands. The Force weren't willing to meet it, and so he was out. If he'd taken a different approach back then, could things have been different? We'll never know. But just when James O'Connor's career looked to be reaching its natural conclusion, he made a stunning 3rd comeback. He secured a surprise move to the Crusaders in New Zealand. The Crusaders had been the dominant force in Super Rugby for much of O'Connor's career, but they were coming off an extremely poor season in 2024. In 2025, however, they rushed back to form, lifting the Super Rugby title for an 8th time. Aged 34, this was the first time that James O'Connor had won the full Super Rugby title. In fact, it was the first time that he'd won the full version of any domestic club competition. And wouldn't you know it, Australia came calling once again. Following an injury to incumbent fly half Noah Lolesio in a game against Fiji, O'Connor was summoned back into the Wallabies fold just in time for the 2025 Lions Tour. Unfortunately, we were all denied that fairy tale ending where O'Connor finished his career playing in a second Lions Tour, but just 2 weeks later, he was handed the jersey. this time away to the double World Cup winning Springboks. And I think you can all remember what happened. He played the full 80 minutes at fly half, something that he had not done in any game since March 2023. He assisted a try and kicked 4 out of 6 conversions as the Wallabies shocked the Springboks at Ellis Park. At the end of the game, he gave an interview on Stan Sport with a smile spread across his face. His potential had finally been delivered on. All that talent that everybody saw playing for the Western Force back in 2008 had been realised. And at this point, having made 4 incredible career comebacks, James O'Connor's just doing them for fun now. In both of the following tests against Argentina, O'Connor came off the bench with his team trailing badly. He inspired in-game comebacks on both occasions. The Wallabies won the first game at the death and very narrowly missed out on winning the second. At this point, he's even making elaborate midweek comebacks. Following the last Argentina game, he flew up to England to train with Leicester, his latest club. But then, after just a couple of days, he flew back down to Australia to turn out against the All Blacks in New Zealand. Was this the last hurrah for James O'Connor? Well, how many times have we thought that over the last 15 or so years? And never at any point has it turned out to be true. So I hope you found this video, if nothing else, thought-provoking. If you did, please leave those thoughts in the comments down below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Enjoy your rugby, and I hope that everybody's team wins. Cheers.